Understanding of the Root Causes of the Environmental Crisis, Lecture 3, Environmental Science. You might have a pop quiz, believe it or not, in an online class, and this one happens to involve Flint, Michigan. Now the question is, in Flint, why, in recent history, would the National Guard have been called out? There's a lot of reasons. This is one that you might not expect. So what was the reason the National Guard was called out in Flint, Michigan? Well, it was a water crisis. I'm not talking about flooding, I'm talking about lead. PB stands for lead, that's the chemical term for lead. Lead and the drinking water pipes. There'll be more on this in a later lecture, but you might see this particular series of questions and notes on an upcoming unit test. Critical thinking. Some questions or statements to ponder. These are not true false sort of things. You don't have to accept them or reject them. They're just things that have come up in environmental science and that we need to think about. Technology is the answer to environmental problems. Whatever is wrong within the environment in the environmental arena can be fixed by technology. You may or may not agree with that. Human beings are superior to other living things. Now there are times when I certainly feel that way, but there are times when I question that. Humans are an invasive exotic species in most ecosystems. I have a hard time swallowing that, but you look at how we have taken over a lot of areas and maybe it's true. Human needs should generally come first. Now, usually we feel that way, but is it always true? All people care about is money. That's a cynical way of looking at things, but quite often it's also a statement that bears analysis. And we can gain and maintain control over the natural resources of the earth by application of technology. That goes back up to the first point. Whatever is wrong with the environment, we can fix with technology. Technology is the answer. Continued economic growth is not supportable. If you recall from our earlier lectures, we do have a limited amount of supplies, limited natural resources. Only one Earth. So the outline for this particular chapter: the roots of the environmental crisis. It has very deep roots. We can explore somewhat of the religious, cultural, biological and evolutionary, and psychological and economic roots. We look at the religious aspects of things. I'm thinking of Western religions, but the same can be said for Eastern religions. And leverage points. How do we make human systems and technology more sustainable? Looking at a new worldview and the continuing impacts of frontier thinking, back up to that cultural root above, and coming up with sustainable ethics. So, roots of the environmental crisis, the religious point. One point. This is a famous painting of the Garden of Eden. One thesis. God's admonition to man in Genesis is to fill the earth and subdue it. Man's dominion over nature, interpreted by the church in the Middle Ages, has become and is equated with bending nature to do man's will. Certainly tried to do a lot of that. Looking at the historical context, during the Middle Ages, Christianity was in that process of replacing paganism that worshiped nature. Well, so Christianity was trying to make a distinction between belief systems, pagan belief systems, and Christian belief systems. There were more than a few adoptions of pagan rituals, but we won't go there. So the religious counterpoint to this is interesting. Is this a flawed thesis? The Garden of Eden did have an early influence on monotheism of Western culture. Fertile Crescent is where much of Western culture is thought to have actually originated. Man's dominion was more directed as caretaking and protecting. Now I reference the encyclical here. This encyclical is actually Pope Francis' encyclical on care for our common home. There are many other faiths that also have environmental ethics. I chose one I'm familiar with and happens to be Western. There are Eastern faiths and other faiths that would fit here too. Harmony of creation was destroyed by original sin, that old apple. Curious timing. The agricultural revolution, if you remember from the very first lecture, 8,000 years ago, historically dated to approximately the time that Genesis records the fall of man. Can't dismiss the relationship here entirely. So we have a human-centered view to a certain extent. The term for that is anthropocentric. That's a $64 word if I ever saw one. And Webster defines that as the belief that humans are the most significant beings in the universe, the center of the universe. Well, the view states that other species only have value relative to humans. The view is just now being challenged, not only in the scientific community, but by religious scholars as well. We can speak to the priority of being over that of being useful. It's also in the Pope's encyclical. You can see how this anthropocentric thought leads to treating natural resources as ours to exploit as we wish. So, cultural roots of the environmental crisis. Democracy. You wouldn't think democracy would be a problem. Well, democratic ideals did sweep through Europe in the late 18th century. The French Revolution, fairly well known. Before the French Revolution, most land and resources in Europe were owned by royalty or by the Roman Catholic Church. Very, very little land was actually in the hands of the people. Well, afterwards, after a lot of bloodshed, there was a demise of the feudal system and the system of land ownership. It spread out to many, many people. The land became vested in the hands of the many. Another root of the environmental crisis is industrialization. So you have democratization and industrialization. I'll come back to those in a minute, but classic factory in the early 1800s. The shift from manual labor to energy-intensive machine production is industrialization. It's an obvious force affecting the environment because suddenly you have these big factories and you have to move materials and goods across the countryside to get to them. You have to build roads, all those things. The success of democracy and industrialization, those two working hand in glove, resulted in a more equitable distribution of wealth among the human population. It wasn't perfect, but it's broader than it had been. Rising affluence and rising consumption. Suddenly we are able to have some spending money, if you will, and time to spend it. Pollution and environmental destruction resulted. The skies in London were often completely smogged over, completely covered in smog during the 1800s, well, even 1900s. So the next route is frontierism. Those Conestoga wagons crossing some river, probably the Missouri River, going out west. It's a movement of people to farm and homestead undisturbed land. This did not exist in Europe. All the land had been taken over. America is where we had this idea of frontierism. This views the environment as an unlimited resource, which in 1820 it certainly was. And that's a real beginning of the westward European expansion in America. Wilderness was an obstacle to be overcome during this process of settlement. It had already been overcome in other parts of the world, but here we had to overcome it. Clearing forests, draining a marsh, that's acceptable behavior because we have to overcome the land. The resources are unlimited in this view, and they're of little immediate concern or value whether we destroy them or not, or we use them for our purposes. The movement is enshrined in public policy well into the 1990s, and I just referenced a book there called A Land Remembered. Land Remembered is a book by Patrick Smith. It's actually a very good read about what life was really like in this part of Florida before development. I recommend it. This is a map of the Istopoga Marsh Watershed Improvement District, just south of Lake Istopoga in Highlands County, the county we're in. It's created as a drainage district in the 1950s. Canals built to allow farming of wetlands south of Istopoga. And this is the direction those canals ran. You can kind of see in that blue highlighter. They're moving water from the fields out to the east. drains approximately 20,000 acres of formerly forested wetlands. And that area that's circled there is where 95% of the world's caladium bulbs are grown. Right there. Amazing. Now the other thing about caladiums, they really disturb the soil. The soil is muck. And there's a great deal of nutrient transport on downstream. You see that little red arrow going south to Lake Okeechobee. Some problems result from that. This is one of 4 such special drainage districts in Highlands County. And really, this is a remnant of frontierism, although it's not that remnant because we drained and ditched much of South Florida in order to be able to grow crops and live there. So, more on the roots of the environmental crisis. What does this look like? An imperial frog, biological imperialism. It's a natural tendency of any population of organisms to expand relative to the resources available, the space they live in, the food they eat, whatever it is. There's a plague of frogs, or more locally, a plague of love bugs. So biological imperialism. All species are biological imperialists to one extent or another. Invasive exotic species are the most documented examples. Invasive exotic species. It's by definition any weedy species, doesn't have to be a plant, that can take over an area from a desirable species, and that may be considered an invasive species. Introduced species are particularly problematic. One of the favorites around here is hydrilla. It was actually introduced in the 1950s as an aquarium plant. It's transported to Florida where it has no competitors. Nothing eats hydrilla. Nothing much. Nothing certainly preying on it, grazing on it, whatever you want to call it. It can grow unimpeded and to large volumes and displace a lot of native organisms. Now, in this image we actually have water hyacinths, burrhead sedge, that BHS, torpedo grass, which is shown here in the main channel. That's actually a creek, fish-eating creek. These invasive exotics grow very fast and displace other species. More on this biological imperialism. We are certainly not immune. This is a map of the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of Western civilization. Stretches from the Persian Gulf all the way around to the Nile River Delta. The birthplace of agriculture, urbanization, writing, trade, science, all those things that we kind of take those things for granted now. It was at the time unusually fertile soil, and that encouraged the cultivation of grains, domestication of animals, brewing of beer, all those sorts of good things. This development began 12,000 years ago. You saw that little blue dot fly in there. That's actually the estimated location of the Garden of Eden between the Tigris and Euphrates River. It's accompanied by a succession of rulers, wars, conquests, all those things that really still dominate the Middle East. By 2,600 years ago, the cities were largely in ruins. There's rampant overuse of the land and urbanization. It's the current view of the Fertile Crescent, that blue outline there. Today, thanks to extensive damming, channelization, draining of rivers, the region remains, as far as agriculture is concerned, largely barren. It wasn't that way 10,000 years ago. Back to our frog. Humans are not immune to biological imperialism. Some major environmental transgressions, the antiquity, past, and the present, may originate in the fact that we want to dominate the same way the frogs do, or the love bugs do, or the water hyacinths do. Development of technologies, that's one thing we have that frogs don't have. It's permitted us to expand almost uncontrollably, if you recall that graph from the first lecture of our population increase. We're going to explore a thing called the technocratic paradigm. Technocratic paradigm, this is kind of most illustrated by George Orwell's classic, 1984. Technology. Technocratic paradigm is development according to the model that we can gain and maintain control over the workings of natural resources by the application of the scientific method. It treats resources, capital, services, all those things that naturally we rely on, as though they were able to be formed to do work for us, kind of like we're big brother over nature. It's the myth of unlimited material progress. Unlimited. This is what happens sometimes when you try to have unlimited material progress. This used to be a forest in Haiti. Clearly it's been cut down and not replanted. Human attitudes and beliefs are responsible for many unsustainable practices. I don't blame the people of Haiti for cutting down these trees for firewood, simply the fact that there was nothing in place to replace these trees. Denial. We deny the reality of the environmental dilemma that we live in, and it may delay our appropriate action to correct what we've done wrong, to correct our behavior. So, something we might be able to relate to. This is a headline from an earlier year, although could be true this year. Vested interests often lead us to ignore the true costs of goods and services. We will certainly explore the true costs of crude oil in a later chapter. Is it apathy? We just ignore it, go away. Is it greed because I can buy a lot more gas because it's cheaper? Or is it a matter of being acquisitiveness, acquiring things? We have an inability to respond to subtle threats. There's this creeping thing that sneaks up on us. Our brain has evolved to respond to immediate, life-threatening situations, that fight or flight situation. So you look at that historically low oil prices. Is that a threat that all of a sudden we'll start using a lot more fuel and all of a sudden we'll run out and the price will go up to $10 a gallon? So Easter Island. This is kind of a rerun of the Lecture 1 assignment. Some questions related to these guys. First of all, question. What is one theory for the destruction of the forest on Easter Island? It's almost like a pop quiz. The answer, there are several, but one of them might be that we cut down all the trees for firewood, or that we roll these guys over and they mowed them all down. Could be. In the reference for this assignment, how was the behavior of humans described? One word. Yes, I'm going to give you the word. It's ecocide. So write that down. You'll get it right. What is another theory for the destruction of the forests? Could be that something consumed them. What would that be? I'm not going to give that one away. Fourth question. What did humans eat after all the forests were gone? Because they had been living off of some foods grown in the forest. Well, they ate rodents. Ugh. And what's the danger of calling these adaptations a success? Well, the danger is we might get used to it. We might think, oh, it's okay to eat rats. Maybe not. Perhaps we should, rather than continuing to degrade our environment, stop the activities that are causing environmental degradation. So, we have these economic beliefs fostered unsustainable behavior without tempering our biological imperialism. We want to keep growing and growing. The unquestioned belief that economic growth is always good, that continuous increase in stock prices. Economic growth, hey, why not? People consume to make themselves feel better. Well, advertisers promote that the goods we purchase will make us happy or successful. Of course, they're not going to be able to promote it to us if they aren't good for us, right? People are encouraged to consume to conform to the norms of society. In order to belong, one must have the right car, the right clothes, wear the right cologne, perfume, all those sorts of things. Or, in my case, consumption is encouraged by the joy of novelty. Yeah, I like tech. The usefulness, convenience of many new products, and I am so guilty. I do like my iPad, though. A little different. These guys don't use iPads. This is a little exploration of a thing called the tragedy of the commons. This is a classic paper written by Garrett Hardin in 1968 that explored the commons. Cattle grazers shared common grazing lands. These commons fell into disrepair. The users increased their herd sizes to increase their personal wealth. There was little cost to adding a cow, but that increased profit they got led to overgrazing of the commons, too many cows on a piece of property. The negative effects of overgrazing were shared by all, and there was no incentive to reduce the herd size, even though the common grazing land was being destroyed. The same can be said for any resource. Fisheries, air, soil, forests. The earth is our commons. The environment is in decline because of our common overuse. Sustainable human systems. Let's talk about some leverage points here. Making human systems and technology sustainable. This is a famous quote by Charles Kettering. I believe he was also some chairman of, I believe, General Motors, as well as inventor, businessman, and engineer. A problem well understood is a problem half solved. Current human technologies and human systems are fundamentally unsustainable. We only have one Earth. We're using it at a lot faster rate than that. Can our technology, kit's what the Brits put it. I watched, I believe the show is Top Gear, and they talk about kit. But our technology save us from where we're going? Well, let's see. Let's change some of our perceptions, values, and beliefs. Unsustainable ethics lead us to this sort of a condition. This is an algae bloom, actually in a lake here locally. This same scene has been repeated many times on Florida's east and west coasts. In most Western nations, human values express a kind of cavalier frontierism. Somebody else will deal with it. I want more fertilizer in my yard. More fertilizer means greener grass, right? This hampers efforts to create a sustainable future. And some of those tenets of unsustainable ethics, an unsustainable point of view. First of all, this is one tenet. You can go back and relate this to those early questions I asked early in this lecture. The earth is an unlimited supply of resources for exclusive human use. Second, humans are not part of nature. We're immune to natural laws. I don't think that's true. And human success derives from efforts to subdue and control nature. We're successful in many ways when we work with nature, but those are those tenets of unsustainable ethics. So, back to frontier thinking. Well, it can profoundly affect how people act. It can give us the idea of affluence. These folks crossing this river were going to get a certain, 40 acres of land for their own to homestead and farm. It influences how people solve environmental problems. Do we truly understand those environmental problems? Are we really coming up with solutions? Or are we just draining the swamp so we can farm this land? Frontier thinking influences our personal goals and expectations. And it can drive rampant consumerism and unnecessary use of resources. So, the other side of it, the rediscovery of true values. The earth has a limited supply of resources. They are not all for us. I love that picture. It's actually a cypress tree in the middle of Lake Estapoga. Humans are part of nature, and we are certainly subject to its laws. Success stems from efforts to cooperate with the forces of nature, rather than fighting nature. Our future, long-term future, depends upon creating and maintaining a healthy, well-functioning global ecosystem. We have ways to go. So the idea behind sustainable ethics. The three premises from the Pope's encyclical. First of all, the earth is our commons. Talked about the commons previously. Earth is our commons. We're approaching the limits of our commons. We are failing to manage the commons in a just manner. That's a Greek god, Prometheus, the firebringer. We may have inherited a bit of Prometheus, a Promethean, I guess that's the word for it, vision of the mastery of the world. which concludes that the protection of nature is something only the faint-hearted cared about. There's a need for science which does these things, offers solutions to these great issues, and leads to the development of an ecological culture to oppose this technocratic one that's in place now. All right, to the summary. The roots of the environmental crisis, we talked about some of those. Religious, cultural, biological, evolutionary, psychological, and economic. Talked about biological imperialism, frontierism, industrialism, democracy. All those things fed into the Western environmental crisis. Some leverage points, some ways we can make changes. We need to make human systems and technology more sustainable. We need to take on this new worldview that we can, or actually it's an old worldview, but anyway. We look at the continuing impacts of frontier thinking, why all that land in South Florida has been ditched and drained, and work towards some sustainable ethics. Just a reminder, the Lecture 2 assignment, you saw the Lecture 1 assignment earlier. The first Lecture 2 assignment is on Costa Rica. The second one is the history of development, local impact from aging infrastructure. You should be able to access that link. And a little reminder, now that you've finished watching, finished watching Lectures 1, 2, and 3, or else you wouldn't have gotten this far. The course assignments need to be completed. All those lecture tests need to be taken. And the Unit 1 test is the next thing you have. Please complete that soon. These are all the references. Just a note that this lecture is going to be available as soon as you have finished watching this as a PDF file. You will actually be able to take that, mark it up if you want to, and keep it and use that as a study guide. Let you read that while I let the tape play on for a moment.